Welcome to the Insomnia Coach podcast. My name is Martin Reed. I believe that nobody needs to live with chronic insomnia and that evidence-based cognitive and behavioral techniques can help you enjoy better sleep for the rest of your life. The content of this podcast is provided for informational and educational purposes only. It's not medical advice and is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease, disorder, or medical condition. It should never replace any advice given to you by your physician or any other licensed healthcare provider. Insomnia Coach LLC offers coaching services only and does not provide therapy, counseling, medical advice, or medical treatment. The statements and opinions expressed by guests are their own and are not necessarily endorsed by Insomnia Coach LLC. All content is provided as is and without warranties, either express or implied. From a very young age, Celia would often try to control her sleep and often used medication to get her through her frequent bouts of insomnia. After the birth of her son and the emergence of the COVID pandemic, Celia became even more fixated on sleep. All of her old sleep crutches seemed to stop working and she didn't know what to do. Celia began to spend her days researching sleep and looking for options. She had heard about evidence-based cognitive and behavioral techniques that can help tackle the thoughts and behaviors that perpetuate sleep disruption, but she found the techniques difficult to implement, and whenever she experienced some difficult nights, she felt she was back to square one. Fortunately, Celia did not give up. She decided it was time to stop allowing insomnia to be part of her identity and began to implement new habits that would create better conditions for sleep. Instead of trying to eliminate anxiety and spending her days obsessing about sleep, she learned to acknowledge and accept anxious thoughts and lived the life she wanted to live independently of sleep. Celia recognized that it was her desire to control sleep and her sleep-related thoughts that was a big part of the problem. When she was able to accept that she couldn't directly control sleep or her thoughts and committed to implementing behaviors that would create better conditions for sleep and help her live life according to her values, she was able to starve her insomnia of the oxygen it craved and enjoy the life and sleep that she wanted. A full transcript of this podcast and an accompanying video can be found at insomniacoach.com/podcast. Hi, Celia. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come onto the podcast.
No problem. Nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you too. I'm just so excited to have you on because I remember when we first started working together, you actually shared that one of your goals was to be a success story and to come on as a guest at some point in the future. And here you are now.
Yep, it definitely was. As I said to you kind of in our emails to start with, I sort of discovered you and your work through the podcast, and it was listening to the stories of other people that you'd kind of worked with that actually made me kind of, because I'd heard about kind of CBTI and I'd always been sort of resistant to trying it because it seemed like quite horrible. So listening to the podcast was really, really motivating for me to kind of reach out and actually get things started and do it for myself. So that was like a bit of a North Star for me as I was going through it, just knowing that at some point in the future that I could come on and talk to everybody else about my experience and hopefully help some people in the way that the people you spoke to before helped me. So
absolutely. And hopefully everyone listening to this by the end of this discussion will think, maybe in the future I'll be on this podcast
exactly.
as a success story too.
Exactly.
So let's rewind and go right to the beginning. When did your sleep problems first begin and what do you think caused your initial issues with sleep?
I mean, probably my dad, because it's definitely like a learned behavior in like my family. My dad has always been kind of very anxious and he always had kind of sleeping issues, which probably sort of projected onto us. Like both, I have two sisters, and both of them are kind of, you know, not great at sleeping. And so probably from a very young age, I remember sort of having weird kind of control issues around sleep. And I used to share a set of bunk beds with my sister, and I kind of had these weird things where I had to, you know, make sure she was asleep before I could fall asleep. And there was all these kind of weird things, you know, that I kind of learned growing up around sleep. So it was never like an effortless thing that you don't think about. It was always something that was in the back of my mind. And I probably medicated my way through bouts of sleeplessness in the past, and kind of, you know, at university I had issues with it, and kind of I smoked a lot of weed. I know we spoke quite a few times about how that had been a bit of a crutch for me, kind of longer term. But it was always kind of bouts of, I guess, like transient insomnia that kind of came and went, but it would last a few days. Or, you know, when I'd had jet lag, you know, I was always like, you know, I'll never sleep on planes, or I'll have troubles, you know, when I go somewhere different and I'm in a different sleep environment, I won't be able to sleep very well. So that was kind of like the story of my life. Never had like the healthiest relationship with sleep, but it was totally manageable and not something that was really like causing, you know, too much I guess negative impact on my life more broadly. Then I guess when probably what you know technically diagnosed as more like chronic insomnia started after the birth of my first son, which is obviously a very stressful time anyway. Right. It was kind of, I'm in Australia, my whole family's in the UK. Obviously because of COVID, couldn't see any of them. There was all kind of that extra issue going on, so I was very anxious, new mum. I think as well I was projecting a lot of my own like baggage when it comes to sleep onto my relationship with my son's sleep. And I know a lot of new mums are obsessed with their children's sleep, because it's all, you know, I mean, you've got kids, you know what it's like. It's you know, the whole schedule is based around them sleeping and then having to go to sleep within a certain sleep window, and so you're just constantly obsessing about their sleep. And then I had this added baggage of, you know, oh, it's going to affect my sleep, and you know, if he doesn't nap then. And I read too many stupid sleep consultant training books for kids that basically told you if your kid didn't sleep perfectly, then they were a write-off and they were never going to have a good relationship with sleep. Right. And seriously, the baby sleep consultant industry has a lot to answer for in causing my issues. But of course my son was like, actually, as babies go, like pretty much a perfect sleeper, with like almost from get-go would sleep through the night. And but I was just still projecting all this stuff onto him and trying to control his sleep. And you know, when he'd have a bad night or he wouldn't nap, you know, I'd get more anxious, and I think it all just came to a head, and I started just like not sleeping. And it kind of flipped from worrying about his sleep to just constantly focusing on my own sleep. So this was probably when he was about 6 months old. We were kind of mid-COVID lockdown, which is, you know, very lucky out here. We've only kind of had one lockdown, and life has been pretty much fairly normal since. So like, it's definitely not a woe is me story. Lots of other people have it a lot worse than me. But yeah, so I guess that was when my sleep started getting worse. I was probably I think, unlike previously when I'd had transient insomnia, and it kind of went away, I was then just focused on like, oh, you know, relying on the old crutches I had. Well, I couldn't smoke weed because I was breastfeeding, so that was one thing. And then and I couldn't really take sleeping pills, so I guess like I didn't have any of my crutches. So then I was kind of spiraling into this space where like I don't know what to do, looking for options, Googling, spending my days obsessed with it. I think I'm someone who probably didn't cope that well not being at work, if I'm honest, because like that was a very good distraction for me. And I think being kind of mum, kind of in lockdown with nothing to focus on except my own sleeping issues, was like the perfect storm for me, just kind of getting stuck in this spiral. And then I reached out to kind of psychiatrist and a psychologist, and then I started taking like prescription medication for kind of anxiety, which definitely helped for a short period of time, and then that kind of stopped working, and then that made it even worse because I was like, oh my god, I've exhausted all the solutions.
Yeah,
That's it, I'm condemned to a lifetime of not sleeping. What the hell am I going to do? I'm sure you've heard this story a million times before. It was very much a kind of vicious cycle of just kind of self-perpetuating, like spiraling and hunting for external solutions, and kind of not realizing that there was really no external solution, and I just needed to change my relationship with sleep and stop worrying about it, essentially. So yes, I guess when I found CBTI, actually my psychiatrist recommended like a kind of free online course for it here. So I kind of did that, but I found it really difficult because I kind of did the sleep restriction, but I wasn't sure if I was doing it right. And then I kind of tried it for a week or two and it worked, and then I'd have a couple of bad nights and I would just spiral again, and it was just very up and down. So and I probably wasn't properly committed to it either. So that's kind of when I initially made contact with you, I think.
it's great. It was really interesting when you kind of interjected upon yourself and you said you've probably heard all this before, because
Yeah.
from person to person, insomnia is so similar. It's quite remarkable, and regular listeners of this podcast will know that we actually have this model for the development of insomnia called the 3P model, whereby the first P is predisposed. Some of us are just a bit more predisposed to insomnia. So in your case, it sounds like, kind of maybe there was some issues with insomnia running in the family. So it brings more attention to sleep, more focus to sleep, maybe a little bit more responsive to sleep disruption. We want to control sleep. And then we have that second P, the precipitating event, which is what triggers the sleep disruption. Could be anything, definitely having a child qualifies. The pandemic, COVID, that qualifies. Getting a new job, changing job, anything that affects our life can lead to some sleep disruption. And normally sleep gets right back on track, as it sounds like you often experienced yourself. You'd go through these periods of sleep disruption, but then it will get back on track. But sometimes it doesn't, and that's usually down to the third P in our model, which is the perpetuating factors. And these are all the thoughts and behaviors that we have because we want, quite understandably, to improve our sleep, but unfortunately backfire and have the opposite result, and they keep the sleep disruption alive. Because we might do things like spending more time researching sleep, for example, thinking about sleep, putting pressure on ourselves to sleep, maybe spending more time in bed, maybe trying to nap during the day, modifying our days all around sleep. So all these things that we then do because we want to improve our sleep can actually keep the insomnia alive. And apart from the specific details, that's really what insomnia is all about, and we see it from person to person. So it was really interesting how you described that, and then actually made that observation yourself that you probably heard this all before, because it does follow that really predictable pattern.
Yeah, it is. And it's funny because obviously now I'm like hyper aware of other people with sleep issues and constantly referring them to do CBTI. And it always tends to be actually a lot of people I work with, I guess I work in quite a high stress job. I work in advertising. It's not exactly kind of low key. And obviously during the pandemic, I think even over here in Australia, where we haven't had it as badly, people have experienced a lot more kind of stress and anxiety and sleep disruption. And it always tends to be the more kind of control freak type A people who are used to kind of controlling every aspect of their life. And I think it's that kind of illusion of being able to control sleep, I think, that gets you into such hot water in the first place. And also is just makes you feel so helpless and hopeless when you're going through it, because you just don't know what to do in every other aspect of your life. I mean, this is kind of like parenting too. With a child, you can't control them either, but with every other aspect of your life, you know the more you try, the better the better the result,
right?
And so you're kind of conditioned to try harder and do more and invest all this energy into something, and it's actually the complete opposite with sleep. And I think that's like the trap, isn't it? Because and that's part of the predisposition is probably a lot of people who are a little bit more controlling and in other aspects of their life.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you. And I think it's really important to, not be hard on ourselves because
Yeah,
we are implementing these behaviors. Because, like you
yeah,
said, everything in life, pretty much everything in life, responds positively to effort, and sleep is the one thing that doesn't. So when we go through life connecting effort to success,
yeah,
99.9% of the time, that's probably true. So we want to do the same for sleep, but sleep is one of those rare exceptions. And the more
yeah,
we try, the more we strive, the more we put
yeah,
effort into sleep, the harder it seems to become, the more
yeah.
elusive it is.
But interestingly, and I spoke quite a bit to my psychiatrist about this. That's probably why I found your program really useful, because it did feel like you were, channeling. You were implementing something. You were on, because I think the worst part for me was feeling like I was treading water and I wasn't getting anywhere.
Mm.
And at least with almost a structured program, you're kind of like, well, even if I'm not seeing necessarily my sleep improving in the short term, like I know I'm like doing something positive and putting effort into something that is kind of going to help in the longer term, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
It's
I think it does.
channeling your efforts into something more useful, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I like to say that we can't control sleep, but we are going to want to put effort or put control into solving the problem of poor
Yeah,
sleep, of insomnia. So, what we want to do is put all of that effort and attention into creating good conditions for sleep,
yeah,
and putting all that effort and attention into exploring the thoughts and behaviors that can perpetuate the sleep disruption. Because we're always going to have difficult nights every now and then. And
yeah,
it's almost always down to our reaction to those difficult nights that determines how long they stick around for. And if we address those thoughts and behaviors that perpetuate sleep disruption, it's really hard for insomnia to stick around for the long term.
yeah. And that is definitely the biggest shift. I know I've said this to you before, but like the biggest shift for me is how I respond to bad nights, because of course, like, I still have them.
Yeah.
I'll they're not as bad as they used to be. So when I was probably in the worst period, I would go like a few nights with just having 2 or 3 hours sleep, heavily sedated.
Mm.
And I'd actually wake up, I'd wake up my husband, I'd be in floods of tears, I'd almost be having a panic attack, I'd be like, I don't know what, it was awful. And now if I have a bad night, I just kind of get up, go and sit. It's like, it's calm, it's peaceful. It's not like, I don't like it. It's not great, but because no one likes being awake in the middle of the night, but it's actually fine. And then the next day, you just kind of, I get up, I stick to my routine, I get on with things. And then it's kind of, maybe even it's a few nights or kind of a week where it's not great sleep, but it always gets back on track. Just
Yeah.
because you just kind of like, and the more times you do it, the more times, you kind of get used to it. And now it's almost just it's just a part of life, and it's fine. Sometimes you have days where you're not feeling as great as other ones, and that's just fine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you touched upon, it really, a lot of it does come down to our reaction to the difficult nights. Because the more we react, the more we can perpetuate that sleep disruption, often due to heightened arousal, more
Yeah,
worry, more anxiety about sleep. And when we're worried about sleep or anxious about sleep, our body then needs to generate more sleep drive. So, in other words,
yeah,
we just need to be awake for longer in order to
yeah,
overpower that arousal.
yeah.
But if nothing else, that shows that sleep always happens in the end. It's
It
just that when
does.
we have a lot of arousal, a lot of anxiety, unfortunately, we need to be awake for longer to overpower that. So, it can be helpful to take a two-pronged approach, i.e., we can help build sleep drive by allotting an appropriate amount of time for sleep, and we can see what we can do to help weaken or to help lower that arousal system. When we tackle sleep drive and arousal, we often see some long-term improvements in sleep.
Yeah, totally. And I think I think it's I'd be lying if I said I was never anxious about sleep, but it's
Yeah.
but it's something that lessens with time, and you go through periods of great sleep and not so great sleep, and it's like you say, it's totally how you react to it. And honestly, like the different, and my husband says this to me when I've had a bad night. He was like, he's like, the difference is just like like a different person.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest things for me as well was doing your course is just kind of understanding like the basics of sleep, and how sleep works, and almost I've done the course. I know everything there is to know, not everything, but I know what I need to know about sleep.
Hmm.
Therefore, I don't need to spend the next day searching for solutions. Like that's done. And I think that's the biggest difference. Before where you're constantly searching for solutions and stuff, it's
Yeah.
just like, and I remember saying to my sister who's actually a doctor, so would constantly kind of ring her when I was having a terrible time in the middle of the night. I was like, what should I do? What should I do? And she kept saying to me, you don't need to do anything. Like that's your problem. And I think
Yeah.
just it takes a while to internalize that advice, but I think that's the biggest thing for me was, when it comes back to that kind of putting effort into the wrong place thing. It's like you have a bad night, instead of waking up the next day and being like making a whole plan for the next night and what you're going to do and how you're going to solve it, you're just like, that's done. I may have a good night the next night, I might not, but it actually doesn't matter. And I've kind of, that's it. There's no need to spend the whole day googling it. There's no need to like invest energy in worrying about it. I'm just going to get on with the day, and that's it. And that's a really, really hard mindset shift, especially for someone who has always had kind of like an obsession with sleep and was worrying about my son's
Hmm.
sleep, and that's the thing that probably the biggest thing for me is, on a constant kind of recovery journey, is just reminding yourself that, like, if you feel yourself falling into that spiral where you are kind of looking things up, it's like, no, I'm done. Like,
Yeah.
there's nothing more I need to know, and there's nothing more I need to do. Just kind of stick with the basics of what I've already learned, and that's it.
Yes, I mean, spending all that time searching for solutions or researching sleep is completely understandable why we would do that. Because again, we want to
Yeah,
solve the problem, right? But
yeah,
it tends not to reveal any big insights. It tends only to just draw more focus and attention to sleep and make us
yeah,
worry more about sleep. And that can be one
yeah,
of those behaviors that perpetuates sleep disruption.
totally.
Um, in connection to that, another common perpetuating behavior is trying to conserve energy or adjusting our days
Yeah,
based on how we slept. So we might cancel plans, or we might stop exercising, things like that,
yeah,
or maybe even call in sick to work. um,
yeah. You can't do that with a child, unfortunately.
right. Exactly. But I think
Call my
that's
son.
right. Exactly. But I think in a way it's good when we have some kind of obligation that keeps our
Yeah,
days somewhat
yeah,
structured, like going into work, or
yeah,
having to take care of our children, because if nothing else, it ensures that we do have to get out of bed in the morning.
yeah,
We do
totally,
have opportunities to do things other than think and worry about sleep throughout the day. Um, Often we can have that temptation, just going back to the work example, to call in sick to work because we just feel like we
totally.
can't do it. But then the issue is we probably end up staying at home doing even more thinking and worrying about sleep, maybe napping during the day, not giving ourselves that opportunity to see if we can have some good moments during the day. Because when we cancel our days in response to difficult nights of sleep, then we kind of guarantee that difficult night equals difficult day. And again, it comes back to perpetuating that sleep disruption.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's, again, like when I first was having sleep disruption at the beginning, before I kind of, you know, got on the kind of recovery journey, it was very much a like, in fact, I even, because I was on maternity leave at the time, I even, made my husband take 2 weeks off work because I was like, I'm not coping. I can't look after Louis during the day. Um, I mean, it was helpful, obviously, because I didn't, because I wanted some help during the day because I wasn't feeling great. But
Yeah.
I then felt like I was suspended in this like emergency crisis status almost, when you're kind of, and that I think then perpetuated the issue of me feeling like there was something wrong with me and I had to solve it. And
Mm-hmm.
now it's like, I haven't, I've been back at work 6 months. I haven't, called in sick once because of sleep, even though I've had a few bad nights, and you just kind of get on with it. And actually I got to the stage where at the beginning, I kind of told my boss when I went back to work, I had sleep issues, and he used to kind of ask me about it. And I actually said to him, like, don't even bother asking me about it. I don't want to talk about it. Like, let's
Yeah.
just kind of, I want to pretend I'm a normal person that doesn't have this, because that will help me be a normal person who doesn't have sleep problems. And remarkably, like, if you don't tell anyone you've had a bad night, then no one notices, because you kind of just get on with it, and you almost forget, weirdly.
Yeah.
So it's a real kind of, you just got to get on with it. In fact, my younger sister, who has two children, and I mean, both her kids are terrible sleepers. She used to say to me, yeah, like, every time I've had a bad night because of the kids, I just get up and you're sleepwalking through the day, but you just pretend that you've had 8 hours and you're fine, and that's it. So it's almost
Yeah.
pretending with yourself that everything's fine, and then it is.
Yeah, I think sometimes maybe taking that approach of faking it until you make it can be
Yeah,
helpful.
exactly. Yeah,
If nothing else, it just helps shift that focus and attention away from
yeah,
sleep. And often, the
yeah.
less attention we pay to sleep, the easier it becomes. On this note, I remember when we first started working together, you were still on maternity leave. And then you were returning to work whilst we were still working together, and you told me how important it also was at the same time for you to just stay physically active, to stay
Yeah,
mentally active.
yeah.
You joined like a morning boot camp. You were swimming.
Yes.
You
Yes.
you were keen to start cycling to the office when you went back to
Yeah,
work. What
yeah.
was it that prompted you to be so enthusiastic and determined to remain so active, even when you were still struggling with sleep? I mean, was that something that was just always part of your identity, or was it you just wanted to shift focus and attention away from sleep?
Definitely a bit of both. I've always
Yeah.
been super active. And I guess, to me, I think it's just, part of it was having a routine, and like, I always felt better. Even even if I'd had a bad night. In fact, sometimes I'd get up and I'd be like, oh, I say to my husband, I just cannot cope with going to boot camp this morning. He'd be like, get out of here, go. And I'm fortunate enough to live by the ocean, and it's beautiful, and you get out there and you're with a group of people, and you're forced to kind of be in the moment and socialize with other people and feel like a kind of, everyone else has had you don't talk about it, you just get on with it, you do the boot camp, get in the sea, have a swim, and it's just kind of remarkable how that just sets you up for the day, and you feel like you've
Yeah.
achieved something. And I'm sure that being physically active during the day, and kind of you're in the sunshine right from the beginning of the day, I'm sure that helps with setting a circadian rhythm and all of that kind of stuff as well. But there's also just a kind of determination to not let it beat me into submission.
Yeah.
And it helps with anxiety too, like, you feel the adrenaline, and everything about exercise has always been very helpful for me,
Yeah.
with kind of mental health, and just kind of setting yourself up positively for the day. So, and it was kind of a challenge to myself that I could go to boot camp regardless. um,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really big point, that you can still do it regardless of how you
yeah,
sleep, because it can just be so easy to believe that we are just like completely incapable after those really difficult nights, or when we have stretches of really difficult nights. Our
yeah,
brain is just urging us to rest and do nothing and just recuperate and conserve energy. But unfortunately, that doesn't usually prove to be too
yeah,
helpful. It doesn't really help reduce fatigue. It just leads to more time thinking and worrying about sleep. But if we can just, even if it's just a case of faking it until you make it,
yeah,
just try and do some kind of activity. If nothing else, if it's something you enjoy, it's going to give you a little bit more enjoyment out of your day. It's going to improve the quality of your
totally.
day a little bit. It does help reduce fatigue because you're moving about. Um, and it can help you recognize that you do have some degree of influence over the quality of your day, and you can still have some certain amount of capability during the day, even after difficult nights. And when we repeatedly prove this to ourselves, it can lead to us putting less pressure on ourselves to sleep, and not seeing difficult nights as being a guarantee of a completely awful day every single time we have a hard night.
Totally. And I used to say to my husband, if nothing else comes out of this bad experience, then at least I'm gonna, get my body back after having a child, because I'm going
Right.
to boot camp every day, and so at least there's some positive.
Yeah.
So it's just, I don't know, it's just having little things where you're kind of focused on them, and part of not identifying as an insomniac, therefore you can't do anything, I think was really important as well, to step out of that kind of
Mm.
identity of as someone who has bad sleep, because I think that's just so unhelpful. And
Mm.
that's part of, I guess, the part of the faking it thing as well. Just, I think I used to, when I'd have a bad night's sleep, it's like I'm a bad sleeper, therefore I can't do this. And the same actually when I started sleep restriction, it was almost kind of quite freeing, because I'd always, I know you said at the beginning that, a lot of people with sleep issues kind of go to bed too early. That was definitely me. When I was pregnant, I needed a lot of sleep, so I'd go to bed at like 8 or 8:30 and kind of sleep 10 or 11 hours. And I think that almost like continued into afterwards, because also, when Louis was little, I was getting up a lot in the night, so he would go to bed early. But by the time he was, sleeping through the night, there was absolutely no reason for me to go to bed at 8:30, but I still was, and then I'd wonder why I wasn't falling asleep.
Yeah.
And so when I kind of looked into sleep, and I'd always been like obsessive about, I have to have 8 hours, and I have to be, but I was in bed for 10 or 11 hours. And it just eat up so much of your life, just kind of being in bed. And when I
Yeah.
first read about sleep restriction, it sounded awful, which is probably why I was resistant to do CBTI in the first place. I was like, 5 or 6 hours? How do people cope on this? I will never be able to cope on this, blah, blah, blah. But as soon as I actually tried it, it was like, oh, I can. Maybe I am one of those people who can stay up later and, and still get up early, and, and actually that was so freeing. And it's been really helpful now I've gone back to work as well, because sometimes I do need to work late and I don't have a panic attack about it, because I'm like, it's actually fine if I work till 8 or 9 and then still have an hour or two before bed, and then I still can get up for boot camp, because I don't need 8 hours. That's like that. The myth busting around that on your course was so helpful for me.
Yeah.
And in a way, like I said, it felt quite liberating, because now I can do stuff with my evenings, and not, I used to be so fiercely protective of my evenings, like never plan anything during the, in the evening during the week. It was very much just like, no, I can't do anything after 6 p.m. Because that's my sleep time.
Yeah.
And now it's fine, and I really enjoy kind of staying up till 10:30, 11. And my husband hates it, because that's used to be when he could stay up on his own and play PlayStation. And now he goes to bed before me, and he very much begrudges it, but it's great for me.
Yeah, I think all those concerns you had about sleep restriction are completely understandable. I think just the terminology there, sleep restriction, my sleep's already restricted. I've got insomnia,
Yeah.
for goodness sake.
Yeah.
But really, all we're doing is just reducing the amount of time available for wakefulness, whilst building that sleep pressure, building that sleep
Yeah.
drive to help sleep happen. So even if, let's say, for example, you're going to be following a sleep window, only allotting 6 hours for sleep.
Yeah.
If that's the case, then we would typically expect you to be averaging less than 6 hours of sleep when
Yeah.
you're observing 6 hours for sleep. So we're never taking that opportunity for sleep away from you. We're just making the amount of time you allot for sleep a bit closer to what your current reality is, closer to your current average nightly sleep duration, to build that sleepiness and reduce that nighttime wakefulness. And like you said, if you're able to give it a go and be consistent with it, at least for a few weeks, it does tend to bring some really positive results. If nothing else, it can just help you rediscover that sense of sleepiness instead of fatigue as bedtime approaches. And it can just be so freeing being able to spend, like, just having less time available for nighttime wakefulness, and maybe even having a little bit more time in the mornings to actually do things that you enjoy or to be productive.
Totally. And that, I definitely remember when I started sleep restriction, feeling sleepy again in the evening. Like I've never been a person who would kind of fall asleep in front of the TV, but as soon as I started sleep restriction, I was like dozing off, and it was like, oh, this is great.
Yeah.
I mean, the first few weeks, or I did have occasions where I'd feel sleepy on the sofa, and then when I get into bed, you'd be kind of ping wide awake. So which is probably quite, I think, a normal experience for people going through it for the first time. But it was really, really like useful for me to kind of recognize when I was sleepy again versus just kind of going to bed when just because, oh, it's 8:30, I should go to bed. Even though I wasn't really sleepy or ready for kind of bed.
Yeah.
And I definitely recognized that I would have, because when I was, even previously when I was pregnant or before I had sleep issues, more kind of chronically, I would be in bed for 8. I'd think I would been asleep for 8 hours, but probably it was quite broken sleep, and I definitely wasn't asleep for all that time. And when you kind of restrict the window, you know that you're in like such a deep sleep for that amount of time, and then you kind of still wake up feeling refreshed. It's almost like you're just being a bit more efficient with your sleep, versus kind of stretching it out and spending loads of time in bed.
Yeah, absolutely. And, on that note of sleep efficiency, what that means as well is that because we're spending less time awake in bed, we are kind of retraining our brain that the bed is a place for sleep rather than all this time spent awake during the night. In effect, we're just kind of making the bed a much stronger trigger for sleep, just because most of our time is spent in bed asleep rather than awake, which it might be if we're allotting way too much time for sleep at night.
Definitely. I definitely developed a bad relationship with my bed. You could kind of go in the bedroom and just look at the bed and just be like, oh, I've had some bad times. And now it's not at all like that. It's, I'm still, I'm still pretty strict about, I'll never spend more than kind of half an hour in bed if I'm not asleep, and I don't use the bedroom for anything else. And so it is definitely good to kind of retrain your relationship with the bedroom.
Yeah. So, when we were working together, as every client I work with experiences, you are no different. There's a number of ups and downs over the 8 weeks of working together. Now, a common experience you shared with me was, and I think you just touched upon it earlier, was struggling to stay awake until bedtime, drifting off whilst you're watching TV, but then you get into bed and it just feels impossible to sleep. And I remember you told me that you'd try reading again, but then you'd find it hard to focus on the book you were reading. That might be the time when you'd resort to that external crutch like smoking. And you'd find maybe you would fall asleep, but then you'd wake really early and find it hard to fall back to sleep again. How did you tackle these challenges?
God. I just guess just a bit of perseverance, to be honest. And also just, obviously you were really supportive and helpful through it as well. And I guess just trying different things. So that I got a bit frustrated with myself because I would just kind of resort to get up and smoking some weed, and like you say, it did put me to sleep, but then not for very long, and I'd wake up kind of feeling a bit shit. So what I used to do is just come and sit outside on the balcony where I am right now, and just kind of listen to like some white noise or like an audio book instead. So I guess it was just a bit of trial and error and finding things. Like I said, like trying to read a book, I felt like I was reading a book deliberately to fall asleep, and so I couldn't concentrate on it. So I think I needed something slightly less, I guess, involved, where I could just kind of sit with my eyes shut and kind of listen, or like breathe, deep breathing, and then go back to bed. So I guess it's probably just a bit of trial and error, and finding the right thing for you.
Yeah, I remember. Well, first of all, maybe it's helpful for us to just emphasize why we often see that real intense sleepiness before bed, and then it kind of disappears when we get into bed. And often it is related to that conditioned arousal. We've just learned through repeated nights of difficulty sleeping that the bed is a place that's unpleasant to be. So we can be really sleepy before bed, then we get into bed, the brain kicks into gear and says, uh-oh, here we go. This is not a nice place to be. And then we kind of lose that sense of sleepiness. And that's when we can be tempted to resort to those external crutches or those sleep efforts. And usually the most helpful thing to do is, whenever being in bed doesn't feel good, is to just get out of bed and do something that might make that wakefulness just a little bit more pleasant. That comes with the benefit of just shifting attention away from sleep. It definitely prevents you from putting effort into sleep because you're getting out of bed. And I think it just also helps prevent you reinforcing that negative association between the bed and unpleasant wakefulness. Because if you're getting out of
Yeah.
bed whenever it doesn't feel good to be in bed, you're training yourself that the bed is only a place for sleep or
Yeah.
pleasant wakefulness. But it does take time, and it's a case of just repeatedly getting out of bed whenever being in bed doesn't feel good, and resisting that temptation to reach for those external crutches, whether it's like a pill in the middle of the night or a supplement in the middle of the night or smoking in the middle of the night. Because all those sleep efforts do is reinforce, if we do fall back to sleep, they reinforce this belief that we need them to generate sleep,
Yeah.
which is never true. And if they don't help us fall back to sleep, then we can worry even more because that crutch is no longer working. I remember that when we were about halfway working together, about 4 weeks in, you were making good progress, and then you had like that one difficult night, which I think every single client I have experiences. And then you have that difficult night, and it brings back all those old anxieties. It can even bring back some of those old bad habits, like that you might
Yeah,
start going to bed
totally.
earlier or going back to those crutches. You feel
Yeah.
like, I'm never going to improve. It's one step forward,
Yeah.
two steps back.
Yeah.
How were you able to get through that, and just have that belief and motivate yourself to stay persistent and consistent with what you were doing up to that point?
I mean, I think I was just it's not like I didn't feel, I felt all of those anxieties that came back, but um partly because I felt like I didn't really have a choice but to kind of stick with it and keep moving forwards, because like the other option was kind of going back to where I had been, and I knew that it had, that I was making progress, and as my husband kept reminding me, like he was like, this is not anywhere near as bad as it used to be, this is fine. And I was just quite strict with myself. I kept going to boot camp, I went to work, I focused on work, I tried to be present with Louis, and then the more times that happened, the more it was kind of easy to tell myself that like it's actually fine to get, to have a few bad nights here and there.
Yeah.
Like even a week, like last week I was a bit ill, and kind of was up half the night one of the nights, and I felt awful the next day, and then I had a kind of few rough, like disrupted nights, and but you just kind of get on with it, and then your sleep just rectifies. And I don't know, it's just such a different mindset shift. It's maybe my
Yeah.
sleep isn't even any better than it used to be, but but it's fine.
Yeah.
Because I know I don't need 8 hours or 9 hours of sleep a night. I'm not going to die from not having 8 or 9 hours of sleep a night. I know I can get on with work and everything the next day. I know I'll sleep fine eventually, and I'll actually have a really good deep night's sleep at some point after that, and I'll get back on track, and it'll be fine. And then probably a few weeks or months down the track, it'll happen again, and that's just it. And I think it's just a different. When I probably first started speaking to you, I was, obsessed with being cured, and I think that's a really unhealthy thing to fixate on as well, because there is no like magical cure. There's no silver bullet for having perfect sleep. It's just something that you live with, and it's fine. Like I said before, it's how you react to it, and just not kind of letting yourself spiral into all those kind of negative thought patterns
Yeah.
that
No,
kind of
I
gets
think,
you through it. Actually, having a lot
yeah.
of people around me that are very supportive, but definitely was helpful too. My husband like would parrot back to me things that I'd told him that you'd said to me. And I was
Oh,
like,
that's
shut up.
great. I think
um,
it's amazing, isn't it? How, let's say we have, like, during this journey of changing your thoughts and behaviors about sleep, how you can go for like a couple, let's say a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then feel really good about your progress, but then you just have that kind of one difficult night, and the brain focuses all this attention on that
Yeah.
one difficult night instead of the
Yeah.
7, the 14, the 21
Yeah.
decent nights you had before that. It really is quite amazing.
Yeah.
But because that's where the mind wants to go, the mind doesn't really care about good stuff, because that's not, it doesn't have to problem solve the good stuff. So
Yeah.
it focuses all of its attention on the problems, and this can, lead to this idea that you're not doing as well as you actually are. If you can take a step back and think, well, actually, I had a good week, I had a good 2 weeks, I had a good 3 weeks, this is only one night. Because if we don't actually do that consciously, the brain will just be like, no, this is it, we're back to
Yeah,
square one, when
totally.
that is far from the truth.
Yeah, totally. I think, I'm definitely like an anxious person in general, and I worry about things. And I think like negativity bias is just kind of something that you do, and
Yeah,
catastrophizing, and there's a whole heap of like cognitive distortions that you have when you're kind of a slightly anxious person that just makes it so much worse. Actually, it's one of the things that I did do with, I found the sleep diary, because I kept a sleep diary. Probably I continued doing it after we finished, and I probably finished up around, I stopped doing it around Christmas because we went away on holiday and I was just feeling great. I was having such a good run of sleep, um so I stopped doing it. But when I'd had like a few difficult nights, I'd actually go back and look at the sleep diary and be like, oh, I've actually been through this before. Like, oh yeah, over here,
yeah,
like a few weeks ago I had 2 really bad nights, and then the third and fourth night I was fine again. And so it was just reminding myself, almost going back and looking like, oh yeah, this has happened already and it was fine, and you'll get back on track, rather than, so I think having that kind of macro view and zooming out and being like, oh, look at this, it's instead of being like, oh my god, everything was great before and now it's rubbish. It was like, oh yeah, look, I've done this before, I've been through this before. And the more times you kind of go through it and cope with it and get back on track, the more it just
yeah,
becomes part of the journey of just kind of life, and
yeah,
it's just how it
exactly.
goes.
Something you touched upon earlier was, that desire to get results.
Yeah.
So in a way, it is understandable why we would be disappointed whenever we have those bad nights, because we're so desperate to get results, to get rid of this insomnia. Whenever we have those difficult nights, it can feel like a real setback, but the truth is they're all part of the process, and
Yeah.
occasional sleep disruption from time to time is part of life. There's nothing we can do about that. But what we can do is just make those one-off difficult nights more likely to just be one-off difficult nights, rather than something you struggle with every single night for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe shifting attention onto just implementing these behavioral changes to create better conditions for sleep, rather than that ongoing monitoring and evaluation, can be really helpful. Because at the end of the day, if we are able to tackle those thoughts and behaviors that perpetuate sleep disruption, the results are going to come by themselves. And insomnia just cannot survive for the long term without those perpetuating thoughts and
Yeah,
behaviors.
totally. And I think I did indulge in quite a lot of, you know oh, if only I hadn't worried so much about my son's sleep, and oh, if only, oh, I really wish I could go back to that time when I was, much better at sleeping, even though at the time I thought I was a terrible sleeper. So,
Hmm.
it's like always like that stupid rose tinted glasses thing. But I think just like all that stuff's in the past, and it was just, indulging in kind of like, I wish I'd done this differently or that differently. It was just so unhelpful, because you kind of,
Yeah.
you just kind of stuck in, and that goes back to this whole like finding a cure. It's not like it's not an illness that you can cure. It's something that's always going to be there if you let it. um so I think just it's an ongoing relationship. It's not a kind of cure or not cure. It's not like you're better or you're not better. Anyone can get it at any time, and you can get it at, you can slip back into it at any time. It's more about just kind of managing your relationship with sleep better,
Mhm.
and not reacting to it, and not kind of going down into that spiral.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think over time that definitely becomes easier, as you
Yeah,
regain that sleep confidence. When your confidence is quite low, it can just feel like every night of
totally.
less than perfect sleep or less than the kind of sleep you want can feel like a real setback, when it really is just all part of the process. And I remember that when we were working together, it was at the time when the elections were going on here
Oh
in the
yeah.
US and everything that was going on. And I remember you saying to me, you experienced some sleep disruption, found yourself, you were spending that time to unwind before bed, but then you would just find that your mind was just kind of wired. You'd find, I think you called it, you were doom scrolling on Twitter, just
Yeah.
scrolling and
Yeah,
scrolling
yeah,
through there.
yeah.
And then you would feel like really frustrated and disappointed with yourself the next day because you had a difficult night of sleep, and because maybe then you reached for those external crutches.
Yeah,
You'd reach for the supplements, you reach for the pills, you'd start smoking or whatever. um, so I think it can be really helpful to just recognize that difficult nights of sleep every now and then are just a normal part of life, especially if we can recognize or identify an obvious cause of them. Um,
yeah,
Often there is quite an obvious cause to these temporary nights of sleep disruption, but sometimes there's not. But either way, worrying about a previous night of sleep isn't going to change that. It's usually the most helpful thing to do is to just keep moving forward. Even if you are implementing these behavioral changes and you feel you kind of didn't stick to them one night, that's okay. All that matters
yeah,
is all that matters really is the present. But in terms
yeah,
of long-term improvements, what you do the next night and what you do that day is far more important than what you did yesterday or last week.
totally. And I think that's been a big shift for me, as well as not spending the whole day dissecting what I did the night before and trying to diagnose why it happened. I
Yeah.
remember at the beginning when I was, I'd literally spent the whole day being like, oh, maybe it's because I, didn't go for a run this morning, or like I had a cup of coffee, or like all this stupid stuff, you know. um I didn't have a long enough bath, or like all these stupid things that you're kind of like diagnosing, self-diagnosing, that definitely had no impact whatsoever and are just a complete waste of time. um,
Yeah.
like worrying about so much energy just focused on worrying and hunting for problems that aren't there and hunting for solutions that aren't there. um,
Yeah, exactly. That I think that is a common trait among people with insomnia, is that kind of ongoing experimentation and monitoring. So let's use working out for an example. We might start paying attention to what time we work out in the day
yeah,
and how that affects sleep, or what kind of exercise we're doing and how that affects sleep.
yeah,
And to be honest, like, exercise isn't going to create sleep. Exercise is good for our overall health, makes us feel better during the day, lowers fatigue. Lots of good things associated with exercise, but
yeah,
exercise isn't going to create sleep. So we can easily get distracted trying to look for all these things that might influence sleep, when really sleep is pretty straightforward. In order for sleep to happen, we need to be sleepy enough for sleep. So we need to be
yeah,
awake for long enough. And conditions need to be right for sleep. And that really comes down to arousal. We need to have low
yeah,
levels of arousal. If we have any kind of arousal around sleep, we're worried about sleep, we're putting effort into sleep, striving for sleep, then our body needs to generate more sleep drive to overcome that arousal. So we need to be awake for longer. And that's why we experience less sleep when we have a lot of worry or concern around sleep. And doing things like monitoring for the effects of what we do during the day on sleep, or doing all these different kinds of experiments, they're not going to generate sleep, but they are certainly going to generate more arousal, because we're paying far
yeah,
more attention to sleep. We're putting more effort into sleep. We're implying that we can control sleep when we cannot control sleep. So they are a common trait among people with insomnia. And I guess what I'm really getting at is we don't need to do them. We can just abandon all those unhelpful sleep efforts. And like you mentioned, it can just be so liberating to realize that we don't have to do all of these things and have all these rituals and pay all this attention to what we do during the day, or worry about how it might affect our sleep.
yeah. I think the best thing my husband said to me was just like, "You're not allowed to talk about sleep anymore." He was just like, "I'm so bored of you going on about this." And now he just literally pulls me up on it. He's just like, nope.
Yeah.
That's part of your weird sleep story that doesn't exist, and like we're not talking about that anymore.
Yeah.
And I think having people around you that kind of keep you honest is quite helpful as well. And not, I used to ring up my friends and my sisters and, on and on, like crying down the phone and moaning on at them. And it's just, what a waste of time, and what a waste of, it's not great for them either.
Yeah.
And they worry about you, and it just kind of, it completely just reinforces the problem. You're just kind of working it into this massive thing when it just doesn't really need to be at all.
Yeah.
And the best thing to do is just to avoid talking about it or thinking about it as much as possible, which is, easier said than done, of course. And I often fall back into thinking about it, but now I kind of catch myself and distract myself doing something else, or go and write it down and then put it away, and just whatever you can do to kind of recognize that you're having that thought, but then kind of put it to one side, I think is really helpful. Because it's impossible to block out anxiety and
Right.
thoughts like that, and it's impossible because because it always comes, and like I said, you're never cured. And maybe I will be in 10 years time, and I'll never think or sleep think about sleep ever again. But I think it's really unrealistic to think that like after an 8-week course you're going to be completely cured and that's it, and see you later, job done. I think it does take a certain, I'm hesitant to say effort, because I know we're not supposed to put effort into it, but it takes a bit of discipline to stop yourself indulging in things that will make things worse, that will make it worse, and starting to recognize patterns before you kind of fall into those traps.
I think you made a really good point about thoughts, not trying to suppress thoughts, especially thoughts that might otherwise generate worry or anxiety, because as soon as we try and suppress that kind of thinking, the brain thinks, oh, wow, this must be a real threat. We need to think about this some more. And it kind of pushes it back even harder. And then you're just constantly involved in this battle trying to suppress thinking, which never works, but it sure can be exhausting. And I think that can be a big contributor to this fatigue that we often feel when we have insomnia, not only generated by less sleep, but also all the cognitive arousal, all the thinking, all the worrying, all the trying not to think about sleep, all the effort that involves can just be exhausting.
Yeah, really exhausting and a total waste of time. I think, and I say this to my husband now, I'm like, oh God, I wasted like half my maternity leave just worrying about sleep. And I'm kind of determined not to let it take over my life in that way again, which is very different to saying I'm not going to have sleep trouble again.
And I think it can be really helpful to just recognize that thoughts are thoughts. That's all they are. They're just thoughts. And, we have thousands of thoughts throughout the day. We pay very little attention to almost all of them. But when we're worried about sleep, those ones we tend to fixate on and focus on. And it can be hard, but often just recognizing the thought, identifying it as a thought, oh, here it is, it's that thought, I'm worrying about sleep again, and not trying to suppress it, not trying to push it away. I think that that's often the easiest approach to take, because it's a little bit like a playground bully. If we just, we recognize that thought, we recognize that bully is there. If we don't react, if we don't try and push them away, don't try and run away, the bully soon gets bored and those thoughts drift away, just like all the other thoughts that aren't related to sleep that enter and leave our mind throughout the day. They enter and they leave because we don't pay that much attention to them. If we can get to that point where we treat those sleep thoughts the same way, it can just make things so much easier.
Totally. And it's not, and it's also not allowing those thoughts to influence how you act as well. Acknowledging that you've had that thought, and instead of then spending the rest of the day Googling how do I sleep better, you acknowledge that you've got the thought and then go, cool, I've had the thought, that's fine. It's there, it's in the back of my mind maybe, but I'm not gonna act on it at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just one of those big thoughts, I'm sure you'll recognize this one, is just, oh, I had a really difficult night, so maybe I should reach for X tonight to try and help me to sleep, whether that's a pill or a supplement or smoking or anything like that. Or maybe now, because I had a difficult night, maybe now I should go to bed earlier, or maybe now I should try and nap during the day, because your
Yeah.
brain kind of wants to. It wants to problem solve. None
Yeah.
of us would be alive if our brains weren't hardwired to problem solve. But the problem with sleep is often a lot of the solutions we come up with, they might actually give us some short-term relief. Going to bed earlier might lead to a little bit more sleep that night, but it can then lead to more sleep disruption on following nights.
Yeah, totally. I think, and that's the part about going to bed early was really good to break, and that's why sleep restriction really helped, is just kind of giving a bit of consistency to my sleep patterns, because I'd have like a few nights of like really terrible sleep, and then I'd conk out and sleep for 10 hours, and then the next night I'd be back to like not sleeping again. And so I think just generating that consistency was really important, and in kind of breaking those up and down cycles for me.
Yeah, that is one of the big reasons why we see these roller coaster nights of really long nights of lots and lots of sleep, and then nights of very little to no sleep. Is it's often caused by an inconsistent sleep schedule and allotting too much time for sleep. So if we allot a lot of time for sleep, when sleep drive builds to that really intense level, we're going to fill all that time with sleep. But then when sleep drive has been relieved because we got all of that sleep, we're not spending enough time awake to build that sleep drive up enough to sustain sleep the next night. And so we hit that roller coaster of long nights, short nights, and that can just be so frustrating and just lead to more sleep related worry, which in turn generates more arousal.
It's that roller coaster of like, oh God, what's this night going to be like? And then you feel great after your 10 hours, and then you feel terrible again.
Yeah. So, we've covered a lot in this conversation. Just upon reflection, just to summarize, what would you say were the things that proved to be most helpful for you at helping you to get to where you are now?
I think probably the number one thing was the recognition that I shouldn't be problem solving around this anymore, and making my peace with not always striving to get 8 hours, I think was probably the single biggest like unlock for me. And just that whole, like I said to you, my sister saying you don't have to do anything, like that, like internalizing that advice and that knowledge is probably the most important when it comes to kind of thought patterns. And then I think just practically the sleep restriction definitely was really, really helpful, just in generating that consistency and like building up that sleep drive, so I was kind of tired each night when I went to bed, because that almost just like acted as a circuit breaker so that I could start getting on track again. So I'd say those two things were definitely the most helpful for me. And then there's all the ancillary stuff around kind of making sure you get up at the same time every day, and the boot camp, and not staying in bed when you're not asleep, and but I think those two things, the sleep restriction and the just recognizing that, or making my peace with not problem solving around sleep and worrying about it all the time, and the liberation that comes with that, I think as well,
absolutely,
were the biggest things for me. And then probably with hindsight now, those with hindsight now, it's also the third piece around kind of knowing that I can cope with difficult nights and not letting that kind of spiral. So that's definitely been a helpful kind of learning experience too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of it, comes down to acceptance in a way, just accepting that what happens at night is what happens at night, not trying to control it, and putting all those instincts to control into more productive areas, like controlling what you do during the day, for example, like staying
Yeah,
active, resisting that temptation to just spend the whole day researching
yeah,
sleep, giving yourself that opportunity to improve the quality of your day independently of sleep. All of those things can be just so helpful, in addition
yeah,
to all the other behavioral techniques that we've already discussed.
yeah, definitely.
All
So
right,
yeah.
Celia. Well, I really appreciate all the time that you've given up to come onto the podcast today, to talk about your journey and your transformation in your sleep and your mindset around sleep. But I do have one last question for you, which is, it's always the last question for every guest. So I'm not going to break precedent here. I'm going to ask you the same question. If someone with chronic insomnia is listening and feels as though they've tried everything, that they're beyond help, and they just can't do anything to improve their sleep, what would you tell them?
Well, first, I'd tell them to do your course, um, because it really did help. Um, you know, having something to focus on that wasn't sleep, that still felt like you were doing something and your effort was going into somewhere positive. Um, and then I guess I just, give the advice of look, stop trying to problem solve around sleep. And the advice that my sister gave me, you don't actually have to do anything. Like, that's the beauty of sleep. Do less. um, and I know that's like it. If someone had said that to me probably at the time, I would have punched them in the face. But with hindsight, I think learning to internalize that and not kind of indulging all these thoughts and letting yourself spiral, be my biggest piece of advice. And also just like, please don't give up hope, because I honestly I was in such a bad place. I was in the depths of kind of despair and hopelessness, and you can drag yourself out of it. Life doesn't have to be that hard. It doesn't have to be like that. There's definitely a way to kind of make significant improvements and have a kind of ongoing better relationship with sleep. So yeah, I guess that would be my advice.
Great. Well, I think that's an excellent note to end on. So thanks again for your time and for sharing your experience. I think it's going to be really helpful for a lot of people. So thank you, Celia.
Good. Thank you. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks for listening to the Insomnia Coach podcast. If you're ready to implement evidence-based cognitive and behavioral techniques to improve your sleep, but think you might need some additional support and guidance, I would love to help. There are two ways we can work together. First, you can get my online coaching course. This is the most popular option. My course combines sleep education with individualized coaching and is guaranteed to improve your sleep. You will learn new ways of thinking about sleep and implement better sleep habits over a period of 8 weeks. This gives you time to build sleep confidence and notice results without feeling overwhelmed. You can get the course and start right now at insomniacoach.com/online. I also offer a phone coaching package where we start with a 1-hour call. This can be voice only or video, your choice, and we come up with an initial 2-week plan that will have you implementing cognitive and behavioral techniques that will lead to long-term improvements in your sleep. You get unlimited email-based support and guidance for 2 weeks after the call, along with a half-hour follow-up call at the end of the 2 weeks. You can book the phone coaching package at insomniacoach.com/phone. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Insomnia Coach podcast. I'm Martin Reed, and as always, I'd like to leave you with this important reminder. You can sleep.